The air in the surgical tent at Chelston Airfield is cold, thick with the metallic tang of blood and the sterile bite of iodine. It is October of 1942. Outside, under a perpetually gray English sky, the low, guttural cough of a B-17's engines signals the return of another shattered Flak from across the channel. But inside this canvas bubble of strained light and desperate hope, Colonel Malcolm Cummings Grow sees only the consequences. His hands, steady and precise, move deep within the chest cavity of a young navigator. The man is barely out of his teens, his face a pale mask of shock against the dark, blood-soaked leather of his flying jacket. Grow's forceps retrieve another piece of German steel, a jagged, tumbling shard of an 88mm anti-aircraft shell. Flak. He drops it into a metal basin where it lands with a clinical, almost insulting, little clink. This is the third man on his table today with this exact type of wound, and it is not yet noon. Grow's mind, trained to see patterns in anatomy and pathology, begins to see a different, more terrifying pattern emerging from the chaos of war. He has seen dozens of wounds like this in recent weeks. They are not the clean, high-velocity punctures of a fighter's machine gun bullet. No, these are ragged, brutal tears caused by relatively slow-moving projectiles, shards of the shell casing, or worse, pieces of the bomber itself, torn loose by the explosion and transformed into a storm of spinning razors inside the fuselage. As he works to save this young man's life, a horrifying equation begins to calculate itself in his mind. The trajectory of the fragment was low. Its energy was mostly spent. If only there had been something, anything, between the cold, thin air at 20,000 feet and this young man's flesh. Another ambulance siren wails in the distance, a sound that has become the punctuation mark of his days. This single moment, in this cold tent, is the epicenter of our story. But this isn't just a story about a piece of armor that would go on to save thousands of lives. It's a story about a war fought on two fronts, one in the flak-filled skies over the Third Reich, and another, quieter, but no less critical war, fought inside the minds of military planners who had come to accept these casualties as an unavoidable mathematical cost of victory. The deadliest threat to America's bomber crews, it turns out, wasn't German flak, but a deeply ingrained institutional fatalism. This is the story of how one surgeon, armed not with a weapon but with data, waged a one-man war against that assumption. It's the story of how he reached back 500 years into the past to solve a problem of the industrial age, and in doing so proved that the most important armor a soldier can have is an unwillingness to accept the inevitable. Before the blood and the steel, there was the dream. It was a uniquely American dream of warfare, born in the 1930s, clean, precise, and technologically triumphant. The centerpiece of this dream was a machine that seemed to have flown directly out of the pages of a science fiction magazine. The Boeing B-17, the Flying Fortress. The name itself was a promise. It wasn't a bomber, it was a fortress. Bristling with 1350 caliber machine guns covering every conceivable angle of attack, it was conceived as a self-defending weapons platform. Pre-war doctrine, championed by visionaries at the Air Corps Tactical School, argued that formations of these flying battleships could punch through any enemy air defense, navigate to their targets with the revolutionary Norden bombsight, and drop their payloads into the proverbial pickle barrel from 5 miles up. It was to be a new kind of war, a war waged by technicians in leather jackets, not by infantrymen in muddy trenches. The theory was seductive. It promised to cripple an enemy's industrial heart without the horrific, grinding slaughter of the Great War. America, the arsenal of democracy, would win through engineering, through innovation, through the sheer power of its industrial might concentrated into a silver-skinned, four-engine marvel. On August 17, 1942, that dream took flight. The 97th Bomb Group launched the first American heavy bomber mission of the war. 18 B-17s, led by Major Paul Tibbets, a name that would later echo through history for a different reason, crossed the English Channel to attack the railway yards at Rouen in occupied France. The mission was a resounding success. The bombing was accurate, enemy opposition was light, and every single plane returned to base. The theory, it seemed, was now proven fact. The myth of the self-defending bomber was born. But the French coast was the shallow end of the pool. As the 8th Air Force began to push deeper into Fortress Europe through the autumn and winter of 1942, the dream began to fray. The missions grew longer, the targets tougher, the German response more ferocious, and the casualties began to mount. At first, it was a trickle. A plane lost here, a few crewmen wounded there. But soon, that trickle became a steady, relentless stream flowing back into the field hospitals of England. And the story the numbers told contradicted everything the planners had believed. The primary threat, they had all assumed, would be the Luftwaffe's sleek and deadly fighters, the Focke-Wulf 190s and Messerschmitt 109s. But the data being compiled by medical officers was telling a different, far stranger story. The real killer wasn't a fighter pilot's cannon. It was an unseen, impersonal menace that reached up from the ground. The Germans called it Flugabwehrkanone, Flak. By late 1942, the German Reich was protected by the most sophisticated and dense network of anti-aircraft defenses the world had ever seen. Thousands of guns, primarily the legendary 88mm cannon, were arranged in lethal belts around every strategic target. These guns, guided by radar, could hurl high-explosive shells to altitudes over 30,000 feet, well into the operating ceiling of the B-17s. The genius of the flak shell wasn't in scoring a direct hit. It was in its fuse. Each shell carried a delicate, clockwork time delay fuse, meticulously set to detonate at the precise altitude of the bomber formation. When it exploded, it didn't just disappear. It transformed its hardened steel casing into a cloud of hundreds, sometimes thousands, of razor-sharp fragments, scything through the air at supersonic speeds. For the bomber crews, flying straight and level on their bomb run, it was like navigating a thunderstorm where every raindrop was a piece of white-hot steel. The sky would erupt in greasy black puffs of smoke, each one marking a near miss, each one birthing an invisible cloud of shrapnel. The sound inside the thin aluminum fuselage was described by veterans as a terrifying hailstorm on a tin roof. The fragments would punch through the aircraft's skin, ricochet through the cramped compartments, severing control cables, igniting fuel lines, and tearing through the soft bodies of the men inside. The myth of the self-defending bomber was dying at 20,000 feet. The B-17's machine guns were useless against a threat they couldn't see, a threat that came from miles below. The crews were trapped in a metal tube, flying through a steel-laced sky, with nothing but a thin layer of aluminum and a leather jacket for protection. The military leadership saw this as a tactical problem, to be solved with more fighters, better tactics, or simply by accepting a higher cost of attrition. They saw acceptable losses. Colonel Malcolm Grow, however, saw something else entirely. He saw preventable wounds, the inciting incident, the single domino that would trigger a revolution in crew survival, was not a dramatic battle or a technological breakthrough. It was a document. a dry statistical analysis compiled in October 1942, detailing the first comprehensive overview of 8th Air Force combat casualties. To the generals at headquarters, it was a report filled with grim but expected numbers. To Colonel Grow, it was a Rosetta Stone that decoded the true nature of the enemy they were facing. As he scanned the columns of data, one statistic leaped off the page, confirming the horrifying pattern he had been observing on his operating table. Approximately 70% of all wounds sustained by bomber crews were not from high-velocity rifle-caliber bullets. They were from low-velocity projectiles, flak fragments and secondary projectiles, bits of their own aircraft, blasted loose by explosions. This was the critical moment of insight. A military strategist would see this and think about evasion or suppression of flak batteries. An aircraft engineer might think about adding armor plating to the plane itself. But Malcolm Grow was a surgeon. He thought in terms of wound ballistics. He understood, in a way few others did, the physics of a wound. A bullet from a German fighter travels at nearly 3,000 feet per second. It is designed to be aerodynamic, stable, and to pierce armor. It carries an immense amount of kinetic energy in a tiny package. Stopping it requires thick, heavy steel plate, something utterly impractical for personal armor. But a flak fragment was a different beast entirely. By the time a shard from an 88mm shell had traveled hundreds of yards from its detonation point, battling air resistance, its velocity had dropped dramatically. It was often tumbling end over end, bleeding energy with every rotation. Its speed might have fallen to between 500 and 1,000 feet per second. It was no longer an armor-piercing round. It was a crude, low-energy projectile. Deadly, yes, but stoppable. This was the revelation. The problem wasn't that the men were unarmored. The problem was that the leadership believed they couldn't be armored. The concept of body armor had been tried and had failed in the trenches of World War I. The heavy, cumbersome vests designed to stop rifle bullets were a death sentence for infantrymen who needed mobility above all else. The idea was dismissed, relegated to the dustbin of military history. But Grow realized the equation had changed. Bomber crews were not infantrymen. Their mobility was already restricted inside a cramped fuselage. They were encumbered by parachutes, oxygen masks, and heated flying suits. In their world, survival mattered more than agility. And the primary threat they faced was not the high-velocity bullet the old armor was designed to stop, but the low-velocity fragment it could have stopped. Armed with this paradigm-shifting analysis, Grow did what men of science do. He wrote a proposal. He submitted it to 8th Air Force Headquarters, citing the casualty data and attaching preliminary sketches of a vest. His design was not a solid breastplate, but something inspired by history. A jacket with overlapping small steel plates sewn into fabric, offering a balance of protection and flexibility. The response was exactly what one would expect from a large conservative military organization. Skepticism. The immediate concern was weight. Every ounce added to a bomber reduced its range, its bomb load, or its altitude. Planners worried about cost, about straining production capacity. Some argued it was a distraction, that the real solution was better fighter escorts, not encumbering the crews with yet more gear. They questioned if the men would even wear it. It was a classic bureaucratic roadblock. But Grow was persistent. He countered with a simple scientific proposition. Let the data decide. He proposed a limited field test, produce a small number, issue them to a few crews, and track the results. Compare their casualty rates to those of unarmored crews. Headquarters grudgingly agreed, but with a catch that revealed their lack of institutional commitment. The project was authorized, but it had to be developed quickly and, crucially, outside of the normal backlogged military supply channels. The U.S. Army had no active body armor program and no capacity to start one overnight. It was a challenge that would have stopped most officers in their tracks. But for Malcolm Grow, it was an opportunity. Forced to operate outside the system, he was now free to find partners the system would never have considered. The first domino had fallen. Now, it was about to strike another, far across the English Channel. With his unauthorized mandate, Colonel Grow became a medical detective, and his investigation would lead him down one of the most unusual collaborative paths of the entire war. Knowing the American military-industrial complex was too slow, he turned to his allies, the British. He discovered the Royal Air Force had already experimented with body armor for their own bomber crews. However, they had abandoned the project. The reason was one of architectural constraint. The crew positions in British bombers like the iconic Avro Lancaster were notoriously cramped. There was simply no room for a man to wear a bulky vest and still perform his duties. But American bombers, like the B-17, while far from spacious, offered just enough extra room for the concept to be viable. One man's failure was about to become another's foundation. The British connected Grow with a company whose name was synonymous with fine blades and close shaves, the Wilkinson Sword Company. Founded in 1772, Wilkinson had built a global reputation on swords, bayonets, and razors. It seemed an absurd choice. But beneath the surface, it was perfect. Wilkinson possessed deep expertise in metallurgy and a forgotten history of armor making, having produced experimental bulletproof vests for British officers during colonial conflicts and World War I. They understood steel in a way few others did. In the autumn of 1942, the American surgeon walked into the British sword factory, carrying his casualty data and his rough sketches. What followed was a masterclass in collaboration. Grow brought his profound understanding of wound ballistics and human anatomy. He knew exactly which organs needed protection and what kind of impact they needed protection from. Wilkinson's engineers brought their mastery of metalwork and production. Together, they refined the design. The breakthrough was the choice of material, manganese steel. This alloy provided exceptional hardness, enough to deflect or shatter a low-velocity fragment, while remaining thin enough, just 1 millimeter thick, to keep the weight manageable. They settled on a system of 2-inch square plates, each weighing only a few ounces, overlapped like shingles on a roof and sewn into pockets inside a heavy canvas vest. This design, a direct descendant of medieval armor, provided comprehensive coverage while allowing the wearer to bend and move. The final prototype vest and an attachable apron to protect the lower abdomen weighed about 22 pounds. It was heavy, but it was not prohibitive. And crucially, it featured a quick-release ripcord, allowing a crewman to jettison the entire system in seconds if he needed to bail out. By March 1943, the first Wilkinson-made vests were being tested in the most unforgiving laboratory on Earth, the skies over Germany. The results were immediate and dramatic. Wounded airmen began returning to base, alive, with jagged pieces of flak embedded in the steel plates of their vests. The armor was working. Word spread like wildfire through the bomb groups. The flak vest, as the men called it, became the most sought-after piece of equipment in the 8th Air Force. But this success created a new problem. Wilkinson's sword, already committed to other war priorities, could only produce about 100 vests a month. The 8th Air Force needed thousands, and it needed them yesterday. The unauthorized experiment had become an unqualified success, and now the official U.S. war machine had to catch up. Colonel Grow worked to arrange for domestic production, and this is where the story takes its most extraordinary turn. The War Department, seeking a facility for design research, didn't turn to a defense contractor or a university engineering lab. They turned to the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York City. Specifically, they went to the museum's Arms and Armor Department, home to one of the world's finest collections of historical armor. The department's curator, Stephen Grandsay, and his team of skilled craftsmen, men who typically spent their days restoring priceless 15th-century jousting armor, were now tasked with designing life-saving equipment for B-17 crews. It was a partnership that bridged a 500-year gap in military technology. Grandsay and his team didn't just provide inspiration. They provided functional expertise. They understood, better than any modern engineer, the timeless principles of armoring the human body. They knew how to layer plates for maximum protection and flexibility. They knew how to shape armor to deflect blows. In a 1945 article, Grandsay later wrote, and I quote, "The design of armor vest M6 is based on one of the museum's brigandines, dating from about 1400. The suits of armor in the exhibition halls are constantly studied for suggestions, and no type which seems to hold the slightest promise of adaptation is overlooked." They were literally walking through halls of silent steel nights to find the secrets to saving pilots in the age of aerial warfare. The solution hadn't needed to be invented. It needed to be rediscovered. With the Met's refined designs, American production ramped up at a breathtaking pace. The standardized M1 vest used durable nylon instead of canvas. The system became modular. The M2 vest for pilots who already had armored seats, the M3 apron for cramped ball turret gunners, the M4 for waist gunners, and M5 groin armor for navigators and bombardiers. By October 5, 1943, just 1 year after Grow first saw the pattern on his operating table, the Flak vest was adopted as standard equipment for every combat crew member. The ripple effect was profound. The most direct impact was measured in the cold, hard currency of lives saved. A comprehensive 8th Air Force medical study examined over 1,100 casualties, comparing armored and unarmored crews. The results were staggering. Among crews not wearing armor, fatalities from chest wounds stood at 36%. For armored crews, that number plummeted to just 8%. A 77% reduction. Fatalities from abdominal wounds dropped from 39% to 7%, an 82% reduction. Overall, the study concluded the armor led to a 60% reduction in total wounds sustained. Thousands of young men who would have been killed or grievously wounded were now surviving. This had a powerful effect on morale. For the first time, crews felt they had some measure of control, some defense against the impersonal lethality of flak. The armor was not a panacea. It couldn't stop everything. On October 14, 1943, a day that would become infamous as Black Thursday, the 8th Air Force lost 60 bombers in a single disastrous raid on the Schweinfurt ball-bearing factories. But even in that carnage, medical officers noted the vests had prevented the casualty toll from being even worse. The armor couldn't save the planes, but it was saving the men inside them. The true turning point in the air war came when the flak vest was combined with another game-changing technology, the long-range P-51 Mustang fighter. With Mustangs to fend off the German fighters and flak vests to protect against the flak, the equation of survival shifted dramatically. The combination of fighter escort and personal armor created a synergy that finally allowed the bomber offensive to become sustainable. The fatalism of 1942 was finally being defeated by the technology and foresight of 1944. By the end of the war, American industry had produced over 500,000 pieces of body armor based on Grove's initial concept. The unauthorized back-channel project born in a surgical tent had become a pillar of crew survivability. But the story of the flak vest did not end with the surrender of Germany. Its legacy was just beginning. The principles established by Colonel Grove and his unlikely team of sword makers and museum curators echoed down through the subsequent decades of military conflict. The M1952 vest issued to troops in the Korean War used ballistic nylon instead of steel plates, but it retained the modular design and the core principle of protecting against the most common threat, in that case fragments from artillery and mortar shells. The flak jackets of the Vietnam War incorporated improved materials, but the fundamental concept was a direct descendant of the World War II flyer's vest. Today, every soldier who wears modern body armor, with its advanced ceramic plates and Kevlar fabric, is wearing the legacy of Malcolm Grove's insight. Every police officer whose life is saved by a bulletproof vest owes a debt to that 1942 casualty report. The technology has evolved beyond recognition, but the foundational idea remains unchanged. Identify the most common threat and design specific, adequate protection against it. Protection doesn't have to be perfect in vulnerability. It just has to be good enough to turn a fatal wound into a survivable one. Malcolm Grove himself continued to innovate throughout his career. He pioneered better oxygen systems, established rest homes for combat-stressed crews, and instituted psychiatric support programs, treating not just the bodies of his airmen, but their minds as well. In 1949, he became the first Surgeon General of the newly independent United States Air Force. The medical center at Andrews Air Force Base today bears his name, a permanent reminder of his contributions. But the ultimate lesson of this story is not about steel or nylon or ceramic. It is a deeply human lesson about how progress is actually made. It's a lesson that rejects the great man theory of history and instead celebrates the power of systematic observation, data-driven reasoning, and dogged persistence. Grove's revolution began because he refused to accept the conventional wisdom that high casualties were simply the cost of doing business. He rejected the fatalism that permeated the high command. He looked at the dead and wounded not as statistics on a ledger, but as a problem to be solved. His weapon in this fight was not doctrine or authority. It was evidence. The story of the flak vest is also a powerful testament to the power of interdisciplinary collaboration. Innovation didn't come from the established experts in military procurement. It came from a surgeon who understood anatomy, a sword company that understood metallurgy, and a museum curator who understood the timeless engineering of medieval armor. It proves that the best solutions are often found at the intersection of wildly different fields of knowledge, by people who are willing to look for answers in the most unexpected of places. In the end, the brutal mathematics of the air war were fundamental.